Hello everyone, I am the Desert Gardener, and today we're going to be talking about garden myths. So I've got my tea, let's talk about that. So talking about garden myths was one of the main reasons I started this channel. They just get out of hand online, so I like to talk about them whenever I can. And I've got 13 myths I'm going to talk about here today. Now some of them I talked about before, in which case I'll just do a general overview and I'll link to the full video down below if you want a more detailed description. But many of those videos are old and don't have a lot of views, so this should be new to a lot of you, at least on my channel. So the first one I wanted to talk about is bloom fertilizers. Now you've probably seen those in the home stores. They say things like bloom burst and bloom fertilizer or big bloom or something like that. And it's meant to make flowers and plants bloom and create more flowers. And they do this by having a very high second number in the NPK, so that's phosphorus. And because phosphorus is responsible for blooming, flowering, and fruiting, the idea is if you give a plant more phosphorus, they will bloom bigger or more frequently. But is that really true? Well, no, actually it's not, because plants will only absorb as much phosphorus as they need to create the flowers. They're not going to absorb any extra and then create more flowers. In fact, the American Rose Society recommends that you use a fertilizer that is a 3-1-2 in the NPK. And the second number, the phosphorus, is actually the lowest number of all three. So if the American Rose Society doesn't think that you need more phosphorus to get more roses, then the same holds true for tomatoes, peppers, and things like that. In fact, commercial gardeners who grow fruits and vegetables have the same idea when it comes to nutrients. 3-1-2 is the ideal NPK for pretty much anything that grows. And I even fell victim to it for a while. I used to boost that phosphorus number later on and found out that it's just really not necessary. The plants will only absorb what they need. Now the first number being the nitrogen number, now that one is always the highest because nitrogen is not very stable and it turns into a gas over time, so it needs to be replenished. But phosphorus and the other nutrients, it really doesn't. It'll stay in the soil for quite a while until it's used. So those bloom fertilizers, it's just marketing hype and it isn't necessary. Stick with a 3-1-2 ratio. And keep in mind, those numbers can be higher as long as the ratio is the same. So you can do a 6-2-4 or a 9-3-6. It's still the same ratio. So don't fall victim to the hype. So the next one is when plants wilt, they need to be watered. That is true a lot of times, but it's not true every time. In fact, overwatering or too much heat and sun can be a reason that a plant will wilt. So before you water a wilting plant, stick your finger into the soil. If it's moist, it could be that you're overwatering or the soil isn't draining properly. If it's dry, then yeah, that could be the problem. So go ahead and give it some water. Also, if you notice that the leaves are curling as well as wilting, then that could definitely be too much heat, too much sun. So consider some sort of shade cloth or move it into the shade. So the next one, and this one is particularly silly. I only heard about this one a few years ago and I didn't really think people were doing it. But I keep hearing about it, and that is adding sugar to the soil around your tomato plants to make your tomatoes sweeter. And this is silly. Plants are not going to absorb sugar. It's not going to make your tomatoes any sweeter. If you want sweeter tomatoes, you simply need to plant a variety that has a higher sugar content. Some tomatoes have a very low sugar content, like Roma tomatoes. Some have a very high sugar content, like a lot of cherry tomatoes. In fact, I think that's the Rosata tomato is known to have the highest sugar content of any tomato. So if you want a really sweet tomato, you'll just have to plant a variety that is really sweet. Adding sugar to your soil is silly. That's not going to help. Now the next one, and this is one I've talked about before, so I'll link to it below, and this is that you shouldn't water your plants during the day, or you shouldn't water from the top. The idea here is water droplets will form on the leaves, the sun will hit it and create a little magnifying glass and burn your leaves. This is absolutely ridiculous. It has to do more with fungus and bacteria in areas that have a high humidity. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the watering during the day or the sun creating a magnifying effect. That is not the case. In fact, watering from above can actually be very helpful because you're washing the leaves off and you're getting rid of dust and dirt that can collect on the leaves, and that can hinder a plant's ability to do photosynthesis. So washing the leaves off, getting them wet, watering them from above is actually quite helpful. The only disadvantage there is to watering from above is if you have a very strong water stream, you could splash soil up onto the leaves, and that could introduce some sort of soil-borne activities. But with just regular watering, and if you're mulching like I always recommend, that's not going to be a problem. So water above, water below, water however you want, getting the plants wet, getting the leaves wet, even during the height of the summer, isn't going to hurt it. In fact, it can be helpful because it'll keep the plant cool. The next one is that restricting water can make your peppers hotter. Now, I've talked about this one before. This really isn't true for the vast majority of the people watching right now. There does seem to be a little bit of truth to that, but only if you live in areas with extremely high humidity. So if you live in the Philippines, you live in Bolivia, you live in Indonesia, you might get a little bit there. I mean, it's not enough that you would notice it if you were tasting it. But for the rest of us, that will not work at all. The next one is Epsom salts. Now this is a big one, and I've talked about this a few times. It seems people on the internet like to recommend Epsom salts for pretty much anything. Anything's going wrong with your plant, they recommend Epsom salts, even putting it in the planting hole before you plant to help things later on. No, Epsom salts has very little use in the garden. In fact, unless you've had a soil test done and it shows that you're deficient in magnesium or sulfur, you should never add Epsom salts to your garden. It is a good and very cheap way to get magnesium into your soil, but magnesium is one of those nutrients that the plant doesn't need a lot of, and very few soils are ever deficient in it. So it's almost never needed as a fertilizer or a nutrient. In fact, adding Epsom salts to your soil can cause problems because it can add to salinity, and too much salinity can lead to blossom end rot. So never put Epsom salts in your garden soil unless you are magnesium deficient. So the next one is seed shelf life. I hear this a lot. People will say that you should only keep your seeds for a year or two. I've even seen charts online where certain seeds were said to only last a year or two, and others 5 to 10 years. But as I talked about in an earlier video where we talked about the bale study, what they did is they stored seeds underground and they dig them up every 20 years and they plant some of them, and every year they sprout. And a couple years ago they were just over 140 years doing this study, and they still sprout every time. In fact, I did something similar myself, where I came across a seed packet of tomato seeds that were more than 20 years old. I planted them. They sprouted just fine. Now there is things you can do to keep those seeds fresher longer. Storing them in paper, storing them in a dark place, storing them in the refrigerator. Those will all help them last longer. And again, I've talked about this before, so I'll link to that video below. The next one is coffee grounds in your garden soil. Now there's a few different parts to this. Some people will say that you shouldn't do it because it'll change the pH of your soil. Now this isn't really true, because if you put fresh ground coffee in your soil, it does change the pH a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. But if you add used coffee grounds to your garden soil, it's not going to change the pH at all, so it's not going to be an issue. And as I talked about before, many coffee shops will give you used coffee grounds for free. But I really don't recommend putting it actually in the garden soil. Put it in your compost pile, let it break down more with everything else, and that is a better way to do it. So just put your kitchen scraps, your used tea bags, your coffee grounds, and all that other stuff in your compost, and put that in your garden soil at the beginning of every season. And I've talked about composting before, so I'll link to that below as well. The next one is compost tea. I haven't talked too much about this. As close as I can tell, the origin of this is there was a guy many years ago that used to grow these absolutely huge vegetables and win all his county and state fairs for size. And we're not talking just a little bit bigger. I mean, these were just absolutely huge compared to the everyone else. And he wouldn't tell anybody how he did it, but he did let it slip a few times that he used compost tea. But he didn't explain how he did it or anything like that. But since compost tea was already a known thing, people just started making their own compost tea and telling everyone else to do the same. But did they grow vegetables as big as this guy? No, they didn't. So there are two parts to compost tea, and some of this I didn't talk about before when I talk about it, so I'll talk about that now. The first one is the nutrients. Now, if you start out with say a handful of compost, it's going to have a certain amount of nutrients in it, the NPK, in that little ball of compost. And when you turn it into tea, the amount of nutrients isn't going to change. It's not going to raise the NPK level of that little bit of compost that you're using to create tea. In fact, in a way, you're kind of watering it down, because you're taking it from a small little ball of compost into, say, a 4 or 5 gallon a bucket of water. So you're just expanding it into a larger container. But the amount of nutrients, the NPK, isn't going to change. So you'd be just as good to take that little handful of compost and sprinkle it around your garden soil. It's going to have the same nutrient effect. But the real advantage to creating compost tea is raising or trying to raise the microbiology of your soil, because the microbiology that lives in that little bit of compost, once you create the correct environment with the bubbler, with the sugar and molasses and stuff like that, the microbiology is going to explode. But as I talked about before, because the environment changes so much when you take the compost tea from the bucket and put it in your garden, most of that microbiology is just going to die because the environment changes so quickly. So there really isn't a lot of point to do it. The other interesting part about it is the microbiology in your soil really changes from day to day. For example, if you add compost or worm castings to your soil, the microbiology is going to raise. But as they eat it and eat each other and all that kind of stuff, and you water and rain and sun and all that, the microbiology decreases. And that's perfectly normal. It will raise, it will decrease. So you're much better just simply adding compost and worm castings to your soil if you want to raise the microbiology in your soil than you are trying to create a compost tea, because that microbiology simply doesn't survive the switch. Now, it's a little different when we're talking the jadam tea and the Korean version of creating compost tea, because you don't use compost, you use potatoes and leaf litter. And this is something that is free and easy to make, and it's more likely the microbiology that you create will survive the change because the environment is the same. You don't use molasses and such. And again, I'll link to a video where I talked about that in more detail. The next one is trimming the sucker branches from your tomatoes. Now, when you have a tomato stem, the main stem, and you have a branch that comes off, there's sometimes a little sucker branch that'll come up in what people often call the armpit of that branch, and that's the sucker branch. And many people recommend trimming that off, and it's a lot of work. I mean, if you have 30 tomato plants like I do, if you were to trim off every sucker plant, you'd be out there all day, plus some of them are going to regrow, so you got to go out there and do them again. And is that helpful? Well, for most of us, no, it's not even going to be helpful. Now, if you live in some place that is very cold, and have a very short growing season, there is a slight advantage to it. You will get tomatoes a little bit quicker if you do that. But for everyone else, everyone from zone, say, 6 or above, there isn't going to be any advantage to it. In fact, it's going to be a disadvantage, because that branch that you trim off, it will eventually flower and fruit. So you will be lowering the total number of fruit that plant will produce. So it's a lot of work, and it's really no advantage except for a few people who live in very cold regions. So just save yourself the trouble and leave them be. The next one is kitchen scraps in your garden. And again, I've talked about this before. People will talk about putting eggshells and banana peels in the garden. Eggshells are just silly because it takes years for them to break down and become something that the plants can absorb. And banana peels, they break down quicker, but they mold and they attract bugs and rodents and things like that. So again, put it in your compost pile. Don't put it in your garden. Let it break down, and then use the compost in the garden. Much better way to do it. And the next one is the big one, blossom end rot. Now, I've done actually a couple of videos on this, so I'll just go over it very quickly. Blossom end rot is actually something called abiotic stress. Many people will recommend adding calcium to your soil to stop or fix blossom end rot. That will not help. It is not a calcium deficiency. It's the plant choosing not to move calcium to its fruit in order to keep the calcium in the main body of the plant to help it survive whatever issue that it's experiencing. And usually that's watering. Too much water, too little water, too much heat, too little heat, salinity in the soil, things like that, wounding. There's a pretty big list of reasons a plant can have blossom end rot, but none of them are a deficiency of any nutrients, especially calcium. So adding extra calcium to your soil will not help at all. And the last one, and this is something that I've got a test going for this right now, and that is a lot of people think that planting your tomato plants deep will give them an advantage. Now, really quickly, when you take your plants from grow lights indoors and move them outside, people will often recommend that you plant them usually about 4 inches deeper than the soil level in the container that you have them in now. And the reason for that is those little hairs on the stem will become roots, and those roots will be an advantage. And as I've talked about in a video I did just very recently, that really doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, it seems to actually slow the growth of the plant. Not by a lot. It will still produce tomatoes, it'll still produce for flowers, it'll still grow big and strong, but it'll be a few days behind plants that you plant at regular ground level. And I've seen a couple people do studies on this and do tests on this, and I'm doing one myself. So I've got 4 tomato plants that I planted nice and deep. I've got 4 that I planted just a little bit deep, and I've got a bunch that I planted right at ground level. And I'm keeping track of their growth, who flowers first, who's fruiting first, who's ripening first, and the total number of fruits each plant is producing. And I'm going to do another video soon where I show the results of all that. So if you want to see that, you're going to have to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.